Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another 2024 election prediction. And now we're looking at the race for mid-October. So I did change a few of my ratings since the last prediction I have made on YouTube. I moved a few races, and Trump did make some gains. I'll say that. He did make some gains in the statewide polling. But I don't know. I don't think he has this big advantage like some people are making it out to be. Again, it really reminds me of 2022. Other people have said in 2022 that there's been a lot of like right-leaning polls showing them taking the Senate majority, and then it turned out to be not true at all. It was just a bunch of right-leaning polls flooding the average, and that's what I kind of feel like it is right now. I think a lot of right-wing polls are flooding the average right now. So let's just set up a safe blue states first. I mean, these states don't really need to be talked about much. These are just states that I consider to be an over 10% margin as of right now. But I will say national polls have the race getting a bit closer, especially some higher quality polls. But again, you take a look at the crosstabs and they're just bizarre, especially this RMG research poll crosstabs for national poll that had Harris up 1 and had Trump winning 22% of black voters, which that's never going to happen. It also had young voters as basically a tie, Harris only up by 3. I don't think that's going to happen either. So I feel like there's a real problem with some of these polls and their crosstabs. I don't think that's good crosstabs. I think they're kind of off by a good amount. But let's get right into this. We did most of the safe states. So we'll start off with New Mexico. Again, I just don't think the state's in reach. There's been one poll that showed Harris up by 4 here. Other polls have shown something completely different, that she's up by 7 or even 8%. Let's see if we could find it. I am using 538 because I just wanted to try it out. But again, Harris is up by 7 in this state, and most polls pretty much have her up by 8 or 10 points, old ones done here. But I don't see it being a 4% lead here. I think she's going to end up winning here by about 7 or 8 points. I would probably put it as an 8% win, honestly. Going over to Virginia, Republicans have been pointing to the early vote and their successes there. Again, I think they're kind of reaching here. I don't think Virginia is going to go down to a lean blue margin. I think Harris is going to end up winning this state by about 7. Again, Trump is toxic for Northern Virginia. He's not going to suddenly pull a Glenn Youngkin and actually make the state close. I just don't see it changing just because Harris is the nominee now. I mean, against Biden, he had a chance because Biden was just so old and he beat him by so much in that debate. But let's just go to surveyed. But again, Harris, you take a look at these recent polls, she has a pretty dominant lead here. And I know they're pointing the early vote that they're doing quite well. But I think as election day goes on, that the Democrats are going to shave away that lead. Again, Republicans may be eating up on their own election day turnout by getting a lot more of these Virginian Republicans to turn out here. And that'll probably weaken their margin on election day. So I think Virginia's still a likely blue state. I don't think we're just going to suddenly see it go to lean blue or something like that. So Iowa and Ohio, they're basically about the same. I think Trump will win Iowa by about 8 percentage points. I mean, we could see a point of a decline here in Iowa. I don't think it's going to be safe red. We had a Seltzer poll. Trump only was ahead by 4. But I think the next Settle poll will probably see him up by about 7 or 8 points. So I think that's the margin I kind of expect him to win it by. Kind of similar to how Biden did in this state. I think Harris will perform about the same, but depends on the margins here. There is 2 competitive House races in southern Iowa. In Ohio, I think it's about an 8% margin. It's kind of similar to how it was back in 2020. I think it stays roughly around that margin. And again, internal polls from the GOP say it's going to be around that margin as well. Going over to Florida, I think Trump's going to end up winning Florida by about 7 percentage points. That's a bit bullish on Trump, but just based off the party registration and the way things are trending in that state long term, I just don't think it's going to be all that competitive. So Trump's 5-point lead, I think it's going to be really a 7-point lead when we actually see the election here. It also could even potentially be an over 10% win. That's a possibility because New York Times, Siena, they said the environment of Florida is kind of similar to how it was in 2022, a very red environment, and they had Trump winning by 13 in this state. So that's something to keep in mind, that Florida could go over 10 here. That could maybe explain why Harris only needs to win by 2.5 in the popular vote to win the Electoral College. So I have Florida as a likely Republican state. It could go to safe Republican. That's always a possibility there. But Democrats are actually doing all right in the early vote. They aren't doing as bad as they were in 2022, so that's a plus for them. So that's why I kind of think it's going to be about 7-point win for Trump. Moving to Alaska, most polls either show it a 7 to 8% lead, which is about what I expect. It is trending blue over time, Alaska, so it kind of makes sense for it to go down to a likely R state. Texas, again, I think Trump's going to probably hold on to Texas by about 5. I think it'll be a similar margin to how it was back in 2020, and that's what most polls say in the state of Texas right now. But again, hurts Ted Cruz the closer Texas is presidentially. Because again, I think Ted Cruz is going to underperform Trump by about 2 in the state of Texas. And yeah, that's just what I think Trump's current margin is. And that's what his internals are basically saying as well. The Senate Leadership Fund's internals said so, that he's up by about 4 to 5 in the state of Texas. Right, we're going to head to Arizona up next. And Arizona is an interesting case. Again, with the early vote, it isn't looking the best for Democrats here. But Republicans usually have a narrow advantage in the early vote. They usually win it by 2 to 4. Like we saw back in 2020, they won the early vote by 2, but independents and centrist Republicans ended up voting for Biden in that early vote by a good amount. And again, it's misleading. They even lost the early vote by 4 in 2022, and they still won both statewide races there. And another key thing is Trump's not hitting 50% in Arizona. So Harris does have a real shot here. But again, immigration is a huge issue in Arizona. It's one of the more important ones. And that makes me think it's still out of reach for Harris at this point. I think Trump's probably win the state by about 1.5 points right now. But I really think that Harris has a shot here. I wouldn't counter out completely. But again, it was only a narrow state back in 2020, so it really isn't unbelievable that Trump actually pulls off a win here. And that's why I have Trump narrowly ahead here by about 1.5 points. So I think he takes Arizona right now. But it's something to keep an eye on. They only really have an advantage because they registered a lot more Republicans since 2020 in this state. So that's a big reason why it's a bit shifting that way. I guess we could take a look at Maine and New Hampshire next. We got New Hampshire poll shows Harris up by about 9, I believe. So that's firmly a likely blue state at this point. And Trump's not making a real serious play for it. Maine is also likely blue, while Maine's second is likely Republican. Nothing really to say there. Just keeping the same margin as it was back in 2020. In Nevada, I think this is one of the more likely states to go to Harris. I'm pretty bullish on Democrats' chances in Nevada. Typically, they usually get underestimated in the polls in this state. And just judging by the more recent polls, even Trafalgar has Harris up in this state. And that says a lot because they usually are very right-leaning in their polls. And that definitely shows the Democrats have a narrow advantage in this state. It's not a big advantage, but it is at least a lean blue state. I think Harris wins this state by about 1.5 points. Moving over to Michigan, the early vote for Michigan looks really good for Democrats. They're getting a lot of turnout in Detroit, which is extremely important for winning Michigan. She's getting a lot of black voter turnout in the area, which is really beneficial towards her chances. So even though a lot of these polls are saying a tie, I think Harris has a pretty decent advantage in Michigan. I think she's getting underestimated in this state just because Democrats are doing great in terms of the early vote in this state. So I think Harris wins Michigan by about 1.75 I would put it at. So nearly a 2% margin. So I think, yeah, a little bit left of Nevada, but I think she does pretty well in this state right now. So those are the 2 most likely states to go to her. Now we're going to head to Georgia. Again, the early vote does not look the best for Democrats in the state of Georgia currently. They need to get that black voter turnout to at least 29 to 30% at the end of the final early vote to have a shot at winning in Georgia. But there's a caveat here. We don't really know how the white votes are splitting in Georgia. It could very well be a bunch of white female voters in the urban areas of Georgia turning out massively in favor of Kamala Harris right now. So again, I think Kamala has a pretty decent shot in the state of Georgia right now, but I would probably still say Trump has a narrow advantage here. I mean, looking at the polling average, he has a pretty decently sized advantage. But Tip Insights, it's usually a pretty good pollster, they say Harris has a narrow advantage here among the registered voter sample, a full field sample, and then we have this sample, which is basically dead even tie. But again, I think you shouldn't really count out Harris in this state. I think she has a pretty good shot at winning. So I'm probably going to be putting this state as a tilt Republican state. I still think Democrats have a chance here, even though the early vote doesn't look the best for them. We don't really know what's going on with the voter splits in the early vote yet. So it's possible Harris could win this state, especially if she gets good black voter turnout as we see the rest of the weekend go by. Going over to North Carolina, the early vote wasn't that bad for Democrats in this state. They got a pretty good amount of black voter turnout in this state. It's a more college-educated state than Georgia as well. And we're seeing a lot of population growth in the Research Triangle. But Democrats are holding their own in the early vote. And polls do have Democrats doing a bit better in Georgia than North Carolina. But overall, I think they're kind of going to vote pretty closely together. I think Georgia's going to be a bit to the left of North Carolina right now. But taking a look here, it's really a 1 to 2 point advantage either way here. Harris has led in some polls. Trump's own internals only have him up by 1 in the state of North Carolina. So this state's definitely in play. Anyone who says it's not in play, I don't trust that. I think this state is totally winnable for both sides here, just like Georgia is. It's really a turnout game right now. It's really getting your base out. So it's going to come down to the wire here in North Carolina, but I think Trump would have a narrow advantage here right now, just based off all the data we have currently. So Trump's at 262. Harris is at 236. Going over to Nebraska second, Harris has been leading quite dominantly in the polls in this district. He's doing better than Biden did. One poll had her up by 9, one poll had her up by 11 in Nebraska second, so it's off the board for Trump. There's a reason they're trying to change the rules in Nebraska to winner take all. They knew they couldn't win that district. And Minnesota, I think she's going to win this state by about 7. I think Tim Walz will help her lock up this state, basically. I think she'll outperform the polling in this state, which currently has her up by about 5 to 6 points. I think she's going to win by about 7. I don't think we're going to see a bit of a reversion for her in that state. Pennsylvania, I would say the early vote looks good for Democrats right now. They pretty much have a 294K vote lead in early ballot returns, and they seem to be gaining about 20,000 votes a day, net gaining that much in the early ballot return. So you do the math, and they're going to hit that target of 500K, that firewall, and that gives them a pretty decent sized chance at winning Pennsylvania. I think they're going to hit about 550,000 in terms of early ballot returns at the end of the day, and that'll give Harris a narrow shot at winning the state. I think she'd be the favorite if she gets that 550K number for sure, just doing math on that. And according to the higher quality polls, she's winning Pennsylvania as well. And it's really just the right-leaning polls that's showing her losing this state. So you just take a look. Again, most of these polls are having Harris up here, and the polls that have her down are like American Pulse Research, right-leaning pollster, Redfield, they're a fair pollster, and that's fair. It's showing a Trump lead here. Tip Insights did some weird balancing in their Pennsylvania poll. They pretty much subtracted 90% of Pennsylvania in their likely voter sample, which is just bizarre. You don't go from a 4-point Harris lead to a Trump plus 1 lead in a voter sample without doing something messed up in the sampling. I think something definitely went wrong there, and I trust their registered voter number for Tip a lot more than a likely one, because 90% of Philadelphia is just not gonna get like disappear just like that. So I think something went wrong with that poll, and I trust the registered number a lot more there. I usually trust LV or likely voters more, but in this instance, registered votes are the way to go here for that poll. Something weird went down there. But again, right leaning pollsters are trying to flood the aggregate here. And even the Senate Leadership Fund's internal poll said Trump is losing the state by about one. So this state's going to come down to the wire. Again, Democrats, they want to be doing better in the early vote. So far, it looks like they have enough momentum to carry the state to a win for Harris. So I have this as a tilt blue state. And I think Wisconsin is going to be the tipping point state on this map. Again, we're going to see Wisconsin as the tipping point state like it was in 2016, 2020, and probably 2024. It's a wider state than Michigan and Pennsylvania. It's less diverse. So those are really all the reasons for it to be the tipping point state over Pennsylvania and Michigan. And this state's going to come down to the wire. The polls here, it's either a 1 to tie to 1 point lead in the other direction. It's all over the place here. So we could just take a look at the polling here. The polling average is literally dead even, which is crazy. But let's just do the show more polls feature. Again, we could see the MU Law poll here, and that's one of the more gold standard pollsters. They pulled this back in September, so the race probably tightened since then. New York Times did a poll here. Race probably tightened since then if they did a new one. But again, those are all the Trump leads and the Harris's leads. Again, a lot of right-leaning pollsters have polled this race, and what's interesting is Fabrice Lee did a poll with the Wall Street Journal. They showed Harris narrowly up here, and then pushing leaners, it was a tie. Emerson shows Trump up narrowly, but Emerson, it usually has a more right-wing bias now. It used to be a bit more fair, but ever since 2022, they kind of become more Republican favorable pollster, and they're not a Republican internal pollster. It's just one trend I noticed, but even Patriot polling, it can only show Trump up with a 1 point lead as well. So this state's going to come down to the wire too. So I think the state's a narrow Harris advantage, but this could very well change here. It's one of the states I'm the least uncertain of. This one's going to be a tricky one to predict. Again, polls in Wisconsin are sometimes quite wrong, so it's tough to say who's really ahead here. So this is close to a 50-50 election, as we've seen in a while. I think Harris has about a 51% chance of winning. So that's literally just a coin flip. So you might as well just flip coins for a lot of these swing states, and you could probably get a pretty accurate map. So this race is coming down the wire. It's been tightening a bit ever since Harris was leading a lot after the first debate, and now there's not going to be another debate. So it's really a turnout game now. It's really about how you get your base motivated to turn out in the early vote. So I think Harris has a narrow lead as of right now, just looking at this map so far, but that could change next week. Next week we could see Trump leading, or next week we could see Harris come back from this close tied race. Maybe she gets really good turnout in Georgia or North Carolina, gets one of those states in her corner. Or maybe the polling in Arizona has been underestimating her this entire time, and the undecideds break towards her. Again, the moderate Republicans, they don't really like Trump in this state. We've seen it time and time again. So maybe he's being overestimated here. It really wouldn't shock me if he ends up losing this state, honestly. We could just see those undecideds break for the Democrats like we saw in 2022. Again, Democrats generally are a more moderate party in politics. So it's anyone's ball game right now. So this is my current election prediction. So if you're new to this channel, I'd highly recommend subscribing, especially if you enjoy this type of content. I greatly appreciate it. And leave down comments below whether you agree or disagree with this prediction. I'm always interested in hearing your feedback, but this is just my current take on the election. Harris has a 51% chance at winning. I think she ends up winning the popular vote by I would say about 2.7%. That's my popular vote prediction right now. But thanks so much for watching. I'll see you all in the next one.